Hello, everyone. My name is Ben Marwick, and I'm a professor at the University of Washington, and I'm very happy to present you my presentation for the Autumn Symposium webinars for Project Tier, UKRN, and FORT. So I want to talk a little bit about teaching reproducible research methods, particularly to undergraduates, and lessons I've learned myself and hope to share with you from archaeology. So the elements of my presentation, I'm going to give a little bit of background to my teaching so you can see the general context that I'm operating in, share how I've come to add replication assignments to teach integrity in empirical archaeology, and some of the challenges I face and how I've tried to improve the student experience over time, and finally a couple of reflections on several years of doing this and gradually trying to improve it year by year. So background to my teaching. I work as an archaeologist and generally do quantitative archaeological science. I use the R programming language to do this, and I particularly enjoy using literate programming techniques such as R Markdown initially, and now Quarto as its kind of successor. You can see an example of this kind of thing here. Probably many of you are familiar with this. It allows you to write. You can see over here on the sorry, let's get the pen up. On the left-hand side, this is the plain text. You would write a report or the narrative text of a document, and then further down at the bottom of this screenshot on the left, you can see this is some R code here that produces this visualization over here on the right. So I particularly love in Quarto how you can have a single document, in this case, a Quarto document that can combine the narrative text and including all the sort of necessary scholarly bits and pieces like citations and captions and cross-references to figures. And then you can have that single document to output something that you might submit to a journal for publication or to other readers and so on in the Word format, the docx or PDF and HTML and so on. So I love to do as much as I can with Quarto and in this kind of literate programming context. And I really am a bit obsessed with it. I think, to be honest, in every opportunity that involves any kind of work with numbers, I will look to use Quarto for that. And I think as I became involved in doing that, I thought I want to get my students doing this as well. I feel it's meaningful and has value for other people. Let's see if I can get it in my teaching. But important to note that I only came to this way of working, after completing my PhD and after starting work as a professor. So it wasn't something I had as part of my own experience as a student. So that required some extra sort of empathy, I guess, for my own students and how they would experience that. In my research publications, I try to have a paragraph like this, usually near the end of the method section, that's quite upfront about computational reproducibility. And I want to tell the reader that all of the code used for my analyses and visualizations is online in a repository which can be freely accessed. In this case, the OSF that probably many of you know, to tell readers about my kind of commitment to reproducibility and open science. And so I've been thinking about how to kind of translate this down into my teaching and prepare students to do research in this same style. Also, outside of the classroom, work as a reproducibility reviewer for a couple of major archaeology journals. And I get several nice invitations per year to talk about and teach these kind of techniques of like literate programming and writing in Quarto to archaeology groups around the world, which has been very nice. So, I was sort of doing this work as a scholar and trying to think, how can I bring it into the classroom? My kind of classroom context, I'm at the University of Washington in Seattle. Our archaeology program, I think, is pretty typical of North American three-field anthropology programs. So the three fields are archaeology, biological anthropology, the study of evolution and adaptation of humans and non-human primates, modern human populations as well. And thirdly, sociocultural anthropology. Maybe this is the more classic concept of anthropologists studying language and symbolic systems and cultural practices and so on. And so the department we have at the University of Washington, I think it's fair to say it's a sort of humanistic social science. So it's sort of administratively a social science, but most of the faculty are not doing computationally intensive or even really very quantitative work as part of their research and teaching. And so in our department, we have these 6 tracks in the anthropology major, and archaeology, where I am, is just for one of these. So it's a distinct kind of sub-discipline of anthropology. And within archaeology, we have 30 to 50 undergrads, so relatively small per year, relatively small group of students within the archaeology tracks. The entire anthropology major, which is what all these students will be doing, does require one basic stats course, which they can choose from a long list. And some of those will include the student using R, learning a little bit of R, but some of them are just kind of what I would call a pen and pencil or pen and paper kind of course, using maybe Excel or a simple calculator. So they're not really like a quantitatively intensive. Most of the coursework that students can choose from and have to do for our degree, the anthropology major, it's mostly qualitative skills. There's a lot of reading and discussion and kind of essay writing. That's really the bulk of our program. So you can see, an interest in reproducibility and empirical work is a little bit of a little bit unusual in this context. And indeed, the majority of our undergraduate students are taking the major to get away from a lot of that kind of work, and they're choosing to do anthropology and archaeology because they like qualitative. They want to develop qualitative skills and they enjoy qualitative research. And so, having classes that do more quantitative work is appealing to a relatively small number of the students, although many of them may have to take it because there are no other options. So that's the kind of context. It's not an obvious place for replication assignments. Nevertheless, here is the sort of the background to how I came to introduce these in my teaching. So I was a project here fellow had this great fortune 2019 to 2020. And I was thrilled to be able to connect to that community and really deeply inspired and motivated by what I was seeing there. And you can see some of the key papers here are the founders here, Richard and Norm, talking about teaching economics, and another project here fellow here talking about replication in international studies. And I thought if these people can do this in their fields, I should be able to do it in archaeology as well. And I was really struck by the sort of powerful arguments they made about how important it was to do this. And I thought, yeah, I'm gonna give it a go. And I saw a lot of success elsewhere, and I thought I will just tackle it. And locally on my own campus, we have a kind of data science institute at the University of Washington called the eScience Institute. And there are some data scientists there that wrote a paper that had this kind of figure in it, which I really like and really felt inspired by as well. Talking about the traditional researcher as the T-shaped one, and you've probably seen this kind of analogy before, where a researcher is prepared to know a little bit about a wide breadth of their discipline, and then just sort of dive in very deeply on some very narrow and specific subject. This is kind of a traditional way we think about, particularly graduate students training in many fields. But there's an argument being made by the data science community that in fact we should consider it, sort of requirement or compulsory to include some reproducibility and computing skills, some depth in that as a necessary part of an undergraduate and graduate education. Not to the same extent as the actual domain specialty. So you may have seen the equivalent of this as a pie-shaped researcher, but here we call it a gamma-shaped researcher because the depth that we suggest for reproducibility and computing skills is not quite as extensive as the domain. There simply isn't the time in the degree for many students to develop that level of expertise, and I think most domain communities don't demand it at this stage. So I thought, okay, let's work on getting this developing this little sort of aspect of the students' education here, replication assignments seem to be a good way to engage students in the domain, but also deliver reproducibility and computing skills. So here's the specific context of the way I implemented these assignments. So I have these two upper division classes. They're coded at the 400 level, so they're mostly taken by undergraduate seniors who are just about to graduate. And some graduate students also will take these. So these classes typically have 20 students. That's the cap, because they also have laboratory sections, and we're limited by the amount of equipment and consumables and so on to around 20. And they work in groups of 2 to 4 on these replication assignments. And these assignments are heavily scaffolded and constrained. So the assignments broke out into several required steps that students get feedback on along throughout the term. And they do not entirely have free choice about what they can do for the replication assignments. I found that some papers work better than others, and part of the goal is to give the students an equivalent experience doing these assignments. I don't want one group of students to have a really difficult, challenging time and another group to have a very cruisy, easy time. So I want to try to manage the experience so they're all having a roughly similar challenge level in that assignment. And this is kind of presented as like a capstone. So we start working on it at the beginning of the quarter and then aim to have it completed by the end with several kind of check-in points along the way. So I have this kind of curated list of publications that I update each time I teach the class with papers that I feel are suitable for this kind of thing. Students are invited to choose one from that list, and then among their tasks are identifying a key visualization that presents, the most striking finding of the paper, and then attempt to recreate that visualization, and then make a modification of the data analysis and create a variation on that visualization, and then make some comment if that modification they've made, like exclude some samples or change the statistical test that's used, if that modification makes any difference at all, to answer the question about how robust is the original study to minor modifications in the method. And of course, as I mentioned, as you know, I'm obsessed about Quarto. Of course, I get the students to write their final reports together in Quarto and in a reproducible format. So the code and the text are all together, and they submit the data files as well into our Canvas learning management system, and that is their kind of final assignment for the class. And so this is my sort of replication assignment in these classes. The topic of the class, the one class is called geoarchaeology. So this is geological methods for answering archaeological questions. And then the other class that I have implemented this in, another upper division class, is on stone artifact analysis, where we analyze stone tools from different periods and in different ways. So here's a kind of outline of how I sort of scaffold this, and these couple of steps are spread out over the entire term. Our terms are 10 weeks long. So right at the start, they've got to get organized in their group, identify the question that the paper they have chosen is tackling, find a couple of relevant readings to give context, and sketch out a group plan about who is kind of going to manage what tasks and how they're going to communicate with each other and so on. The next step is a method sketch. So they have to tell me, like, what are the R packages that they need to do their work? What's the data set? The name of the data file. They've got to prove they can find the data file at this point. And then finally, they sort of put together a draft. And at all of these steps, I'm giving them a little bit of feedback. And particularly step one is quite important, because sometimes I will suggest students choose a different paper if they've chosen a paper from my list that I feel might not be very well suited to the background of those students. As I will say, and I will show you shortly, the background is quite varied of some of the students. Anyway, so finally, I give them feedback at each of these steps. Step 3, we have a draft, and then the final submission, and then the final sort of appendix is like a lab project collaboration statement. So these steps are spread out over the whole quarter, and there's lots of feedback for opportunities for feedback and for me to guide them to a successful project. And so the first time I did this, I also ran a kind of survey of the students to try to understand their experience of doing it a bit better. And so here are the results of some of the survey. The text up here, this first one says, "I had sufficient support from the instructors to succeed," and you can see most students responded strongly agree or agree. And the next one is the instructions were clear, detailed, and relevant, and there's a lot of agreement there. And then the third one is the ability to replicate published research is an important skill for professional archaeologists. And now I'm getting them to think about, is this something that's meaningful for the future beyond the classroom, or are they just doing this to, get the grade? And there's a little bit of skepticism about the value of it here. Further down, replicating a published finding helped me to understand the published paper better. Okay, so most people did agree with that, but a few people not so sure that it added to their understanding. And then the final statement was, I am likely to attempt to replicate published research in my future studies. And, and so a few students felt that this might be relevant, but probably the majority of them were not really sure that this was a thing that they would ever do again. They would certainly do it again if they took another class with me, and most of them do. But after they graduate, I suppose they don't see that quite so much. And then further down here, first experience, yes or no, for most people it was, and I'm so curious to know where else they might have done this. Wasn't able to dig a bit deeper in this case. First time to use R. So for many students, it is the first time to use R in any kind of archaeology assignment. For a small number, they've used it before. So you can see the sort of nature of the student reaction and how prepared they were for this kind of assignment. Here's looking at the correlation among the feedback items with the Likert scale from the previous slide. And the size of the dot indicates the magnitude of the correlation. The color indicates the direction. So the blue dots are positive, and the bigger blue dot is a strong positive correlation. For example, sufficient support and instructions were clear, strongly correlated. But these ones down here, the students' belief in whether or not they're going to do this kind of work again, do replication again, is generally negatively correlated with everything. So, and I interpret this to suggest that maybe they don't feel that they received so much support from the instructor, they didn't feel capable of doing it by themselves actually in the future. So while they were quite happy with the getting support and good instructions, it seemed like maybe if they were doing this independently, they might struggle. And I did have a kind of some space for some free form comments on this study for students to submit just anything they wanted to say. And one of them did say it would not have been possible for us to do this correctly on our own. So this kind of made me feel there was a bit of a gap in this whole implementation. They were too dependent on the instructor to succeed with this, and I sort of needed to equip students with skills to work a bit more independently and strengthen their kind of self-efficacy around quantitative computational work and replication skills. We published the sort of background to the assignment, the structure of the assignment, and the results of the survey in a paper in an archaeology journal called Advances to Archaeological Practice. Now, this is my teaching assistant, and these were two of the students, one undergraduate student, one graduate student in the class. So it's kind of available for people to review and study and implement. And it's been cited a few times. It was published in 2020, and I've had several nice email requests from people who want to try something similar in their own archaeology classroom and do replication assignments for archaeology classes. So this had some impact. Now, so it's been going pretty well, and I haven't made a lot of changes to those particular replication assignments, but I have given a lot of thought to how to improve the experience before a student gets into those particular classes and to kind of prepare them a bit better. So I was pretty unsatisfied with how unprepared some students were to succeed. There's a lot of variation in the ability of students to succeed, and some students require a lot of support, and others don't need any. Students who've taken a couple of statistics classes that use R are very comfortable, familiar, and students who took more of this sort of pencil on paper, the single stats class for the requirement, they struggled a lot more. So I thought, what can I do to kind of even this out and take some of the pressure off the instructor in terms of providing support? So I designed a lower division introductory archaeology course to prepare students for these replication assignments in the upper division ones. And this has been extremely satisfying. So this is called Introduction to Archaeological Data Science. And it's really what it is in disguise is a class on using R and Quarto for undergrads using archaeological data sets to answer archaeological problems. And that spans a wide variety of topics and time periods and so on. We have 10 labs, one per week. And we do much the same kind of thing as we do for the replication assignments in the upper division class. The goal is to recreate a simple version of key visualizations in real world published studies, and the students work in Quarto. The original publications maybe didn't use R or Quarto at all, but there's enough raw data available for us to kind of recreate a version of the key visualization in R and Quarto. So in this class, we don't have students doing any modification to test the robustness of the study. The goal is simply to, and they don't have to identify the key visualization. I tell them what it is. They just have to work through the creation of that visualization and then a brief kind of interpretation of it. And here's the list of topics for this lower level class. So you can see we start at Paleolithic cave art. We talk about ancient farming and domestication, the origins of Stonehenge, social inequality. So this is designed to be the first archaeology class that anyone takes and be really a broad appeal. Egyptian pyramids, Stonehenge on Easter Island, Mayan civilization collapse, all what I would call the sort of smash hits of archaeology. And I've tried to aim for some kind of sort of social relevance as well. The lives of enslaved Africans, the archaeology of Nazi death camps. And there's a final project that students will do as well, which is usually related to a nice Paleolithic data set that I enjoy working with. So students get a much simpler and sort of more shorter experience with replication assignments through this class. They certainly get to know a bit about R and Quarto and the kind of mechanics of using RStudio and so on through this class, which I feel then is good preparation and takes some of that. So I can offload some of the introductory instruction from the upper division classes into this one. And this class is also, this sort of lower division class, also quite good because it fulfills a bunch of programmatic requirements. I have 75 students, so it's quite a bit bigger than the upper division classes. I do have a TA who's more or less helpful depending on the background of the TA, and it does fulfill requirements for the major. And it turns out I discovered by sort of accident that it's on a list for fulfilling requirements for other majors. It does a sort of quantitative studies skills requirement for environmental studies, I think. So it's useful in multiple ways, as well as helping me prepare students for the upper division class. I have not yet made it an official requirement. So we can, as probably in many of your institutions, you can have a prerequisite for an upper division class. There's certain lower division class students have to take them in a sequence, very common thing to do. I haven't done that yet in this case for the two. I think it could make it difficult for some students who can't. We have, for example, a lot of students who transfer from community colleges and just have 2 years on our campus rather than 4 years for the students coming straight from high school. And for those students, it can be difficult to meet degree requirements if there are a lot of prerequisite chains there. So for the moment, I haven't done that, but I do strongly recommend students who are in the lower division class. I say, hey, if you took this class and enjoyed it, you're probably going to love these other classes that I teach because we can do more stuff with R and so on. So try to make the connections pretty clear for students, even though it's not an official prerequisite or requirement at the moment. That might change. Okay, so I started doing this in 2019, around the same time as as I was a project TA fellow. That really gave me the kind of confidence to make a big change to my pedagogy like that. So after a couple of years, I guess I can share a few reflections on the experience. So I do feel quite satisfied. The replication assignments, they're a kind of experiment that has persisted, and I really enjoy kind of doing them year after year and slightly modifying the list of papers that students use and seeing how students tackle the problems. The lower division class, which was a completely new class for me, this turned out to be really great, very satisfying, very effective as this gentle, fun introduction to R and the concept of replication and kind of writing code that students often are doing for the very first time. Probably it's not 100% kind of pipeline, so probably only about half of the students in the upper division student classes were first introduced the replication assignment, probably only half of them have taken this class that's intended to prepare them. So, half of the students have taken it and are familiar with R and Quarto and the notion of working reproducibly, and the other half, it's completely foreign concept. So it hasn't worked exactly perfectly, but what I've found is that it makes a big difference. Even having about half of them take the kind of preparatory class makes a huge difference. And when students are working in those groups of 2 to 4, some of the students in the group are familiar with Quarto and can kind of teach the others and support them in doing their replication assignment. And that really takes quite a load off the TA and I in terms of supporting students. We don't have to teach them, but using R for the very first time, because their peers will be helping them out with that to some degree. And that said, I still find that the teaching assistants that I get for these classes, I don't get to have a lot of choice over who they are due to the way the funding, graduate student funding is organized in our program. And so sometimes TAs come to my class and they're learning R for the first time as well. And so that can add a little bit of friction to the process. So the load sort of shifts from year to year, depending on how experienced and willing the TA is to get involved in these kind of things. So that's a factor that's a bit out of my control, but it's manageable. And so overall, this sort of 2 core sequence, it would be ideal if it was a required prerequisite. I'm not quite sure how that will affect the accessibility of the upper division classes. That's why I'm holding off a bit. But I definitely feel it's been a really good improvement in terms of preparing students for the upper division replication assignment and sort of setting their expectations as well around what the nature of the assignment is and what the effort and sort of skills that are required. And some students, will, as they talk to their peers about the lower level class, get a sort of sense of it and then reach out to me and say, hey, I heard we have to do something. I didn't tell you a class, but I want to prepare somehow. What do you recommend? And then I can usually recommend them some data carpentry, self-guided tutorials, for example. So all of that, I think, it makes a difference to aligning students' expectations with mine and have everyone having a really satisfying experience. So a couple of concluding thoughts on this implementation of replication assignments. So I think my experience suggests that these can be a meaningful part of upper and lower division classes in any social science. I'm in a pretty humanistic social science. My department doesn't really have this as the core kind of skill or value of the major, and yet I've been able to do it, and it seems to be, the students seem to keep taking the classes. So I think it's succeeding. I think having a sequence, firstly, of smaller tasks within the single assignment, within a single course, is really essential, or at least in my case, has been really essential for student success. Gives many opportunities to check in and assist and guide students. And this larger sequence of 2 classes also seems to be really important for students' success and satisfaction in doing this, what is for most of them unfamiliar work with R and Quarto and RStudio and things that they chose anthropology to get away from all that stuff and they don't want to do any computer sciencey stuff, but here they are. And so dividing it up into lots of small steps and giving lots of chances for feedback and for justification, like my justification of why we're doing this, I think has been helpful to make it really satisfying. And I would definitely recommend it to others considering implementing this. That said, I find this is still a fairly idiosyncratic form of pedagogy, just in my department. I think we have 4 or 5 archaeology faculty. I'm the only one who's doing anything like this, and even after a few years, my colleagues have not seen it to be necessary to add into their classes. And even in the broader discipline, it's a relatively small number of people who are thinking about working this way. Unlike, I think, for example, economics, where in graduate programs, it's sort of considered like a staple, traditional part of going through the graduate program to replicate a major study. In archaeology, we're not quite, that's not such an equivalent thing, but perhaps with time, that will change and this will become a more normal and typical and valued activity. That's certainly my hope. Anyway, thanks for for joining my recording, and I look forward to discussing it further with you in the live session coming up in a week or so. Okay, thanks very much.